Hello, and welcome to the Rainbow Project's third annual Stakeholder Forum, sponsored by Green Clock Agency. It's the Everything Video Agency. Good evening to all of you. I'm Charlotte Deleste from News 3 Now, and I'm going to be your host for tonight. We are so very glad that you could join us this evening for this virtual event. There's a first for everything, and we are going to blow this up, so to speak. This is going to be a good time. So we want to give you our agenda for tonight. First, we're going to hear some welcoming remarks from the very talented and gifted Cheryl Cato, the Executive Director of the Rainbow Project, Dr. Jonathan Vu, the President of the Rainbow Board of Directors, and Ian Carroll, also a Rainbow Board member. After that, we're going to get a little deeper look at some of the Rainbow Project's services with a video that was made by Green Clock. And then we're going to culminate the evening with Dr. Richard Davidson's presentation, Well-Being is a Skill, Lessons for the Current Pandemic. And that will be followed by a very short Q&A. Now I'm going to hand it over to Cheryl, Jonathan, and Ian for their welcoming remarks.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. I can't think of a more perfect person to be doing this tonight. And thank you so much for the community work that you do in your Doing Something Good initiatives, and really appreciate you being here. I am Cheryl Cato, and I'm the director and a child and family therapist here at the Rainbow Project. And I extend a very warm welcome to all of you who are participating. It's difficult to see you all, but I feel your presence and your love. So enjoy that you are all participating. And I wanted to just say that in a crisis, a person's true colors come through. And I think that's so true with our incredible staff. And I just wanted to give a shout out to how in all of this, they have risen way above and beyond the call of duty. In meeting and connecting and overcoming some barriers to provide the services that we need to help folks overcome trauma. So I wanted to put a shout out to them. They're very hardworking and agile, and we're also very honored to work with our families who have also risen to the occasion. So speaking of that, I wanted to thank some of our community partners who every day we work with in working sometimes with mutual families. We don't do this all alone. And then also for over 40 years, we've been working with our wonderful funders who have really initiated proactively asking how we're doing and how they can help. And so we really are grateful and appreciate that too. We are also working very hard with, it seems we're quiet, but because our clinic is closed, but we're actually busier than ever. And just in terms of I'd say the focus, the catalyst of time that we're in right now, with not only the pandemic, but the move in the Black Lives Matter movement, wanted to just say that we are committed to their purpose and to doing what we can to provide the equity for the children and families in our community. So I'd like to welcome Jonathan Vu, our president.
My name is Jonathan Vu. I'm one of the psychiatrists over at Meriter Hospital's Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Unit. And I'm proud to be serving on Rainbow's Board of Directors. I learned about Rainbow Project while on a rotation here during my child psychiatry training. All of the child and adolescent psychiatry fellows who train at EW are required to spend some time at Rainbow in order to learn about the treatment of childhood trauma. It's one of the best places for that. And during the time that I was shadowing with therapists here, I really saw the quality of the clinicians and the programming and the difference that it made for the children who are being seen. And now, as a mental health provider in the community, I've really been able to see the important role that Rainbow Project plays. It's definitely the first place that we think of when we're referring children who have trauma histories. Rainbow Project is a valuable community resource that's providing care that's in high demand. and can't be found elsewhere with such a great level of quality. And I'll let Ian say a few words.
Yeah, for sure. So I just want to thank you all again for spending your time with us virtually tonight. I also want to thank Dr. Davidson for so graciously agreeing to talk with us, and Charlotte for hosting tonight. So my name's Ian Carroll. I'm currently finishing up my PhD in clinical psych at UW-Madison, and I've had the privilege of being a board member for over a year now. And I'm just so thankful to have been a part of this wonderful organization. Professionally, I've always viewed my clinical career as a social justice practice grounded in providing equitable mental health services to children and their families. That being said, rarely do you find an organization like Rainbow in the field. It's been a staple of our community for 40 years, has a history of changing lives of countless children and families, all while being devoted to making its services accessible to meet the diverse needs of its consumers. At a time when there's so much uncertainty in the lives of children and our families in the community, Rainbow bravely continues to do what it's done for 40 years, that is working with families to promote well-being in their lives. So I just personally want to say thank you to Cheryl and all the amazing staff at Rainbow for continuing to do the important work that you do. And again, thank you for being here with us tonight and continuing to support Rainbow Project's mission. So I think I'll pass it back to Charlotte.
All right, thank you, Cheryl, Jonathan, and Ian. Now I would like to invite you to sit back and enjoy a closer look at Rainbow's work with a video brought to you by Green Clock.
I am personally passionate about the work that we do here at the Rainbow Project because I see the need, but I also see the results of the work that we do.
It builds a sense of hope, not only for them, but for us. Especially now at this crucial time where it feels like things are hopeless. It's something concrete that we can hold on to as an example of this is what the impact of mental health and early intervention can be.
So in March, once the orders were given that things were shutting down, we immediately started to contact families, let them know kind of the state of things, and at that point it was a little unclear, but we were working on developing and implementing our telehealth practices. And this is something that we had not done before, and so it took about 2 weeks before we were able to get staff trained, get the online platform set up, and to start to connect and do treatment.
There's obviously a huge need, not only just for Latinos, but just for people of color. We're talking about marginalized identities that are dealing with systemic oppression on a daily basis. And there's a high prevalence of trauma in these communities. And the lack of support and the lack of resources, it ends up inhibiting their future success or their future development. So as far as the Spanish-speaking services that Rainbow provides, it's very blatant that there's a lack of services for the Madison community, especially the Latinos communities. So what we try to do is we try to accommodate and try to give as much services as we can. And the way we do that is we offered, in addition to 3 bilingual Spanish-speaking therapists, 3 different programs.
The board members that I have known don't just stop at coming to Rainbow board meetings. They become more activists in the community. And that's the transforming process I think that Rainbow brings to everybody. I thank Rainbow for changing me from being an observer to a doer, and I have been mentoring and teaching ever since, everywhere from 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders to high school and college age people.
The Rainbow Project does a phenomenal job of coming around the entire family and supporting that family through dyadic work and also through the groups that Rainbow Project offers for adult caregivers to come and to be able to get the support they need so that they can start to talk to their children about these really difficult circumstances that have happened in their life, and also to be able to talk about the feelings that are related to that and to offer kids the ability to see that this is something they can, as a family, move beyond, and it's not just the child's job to do that.
I think collaboration with other agencies is critical because if you're really concerned about an individual child or family, they live in many different worlds in the community. And so when we think about, for example, domestic abuse intervention services, they are a crisis shelter. But when they leave the shelter after a certain number of days, they have to pass that baton to other agencies in order to make sure that that support continues. And that seamlessness from one agency to another is something that I think we all pride ourselves with. In the last year, the Rainbow Project has been able to make a major impact because of the support that we've received from the community. That energizes us. We accept that trust in their investment to be even more dedicated to our mission.
And I think giving money to a place like the Rainbow Project helps that, in that we help the folks who've experienced hardships. You know, we help steer them back on track, and we help promote them to have a healthier and happier future.
It's an organization that is so in tune with the needs of our society. And I can imagine during this COVID-19, some of the cases they're dealing with. It makes you sad on the one hand, but also very encouraged because there is a resource. And I think that's what makes Madison special.
That was unbelievable. Thank you very much to Green Clock for that wonderful video and continuing to support Rainbow Project. And Cheryl, to all of your board members and to all who work for Rainbow Project, thank you for what you do every day. It is such a vital, vital service. And sadly, it's something that we're going to need for quite some time yet. But thank you for your passion and your love for people and for a better community. Thank you. Now we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Richard Davidson. Dr. Davidson is the William James and Vilas Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the founder and director of the Center for Healthy Minds. He is best known for his groundbreaking work studying emotion and the brain. A friend and confidant of the Dalai Lama, he is a highly sought after expert and speaker leading conversations on well-being on international stages such as the World Economic Forum, where he serves on the Global Council on Mental Health. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Davidson.
Thank you so much. I very much appreciate being asked to participate this evening. And let me begin by simply expressing my appreciation and gratitude to all the people associated with the Rainbow Project, to Cheryl for her tireless work on behalf of children and families, for the therapists, the board members, for Ian, Carroll, who reached out and explicitly invited me this evening. I'm very happy to be here and to share with you a little bit about our own journey and how it might intersect with the work being done at the Rainbow Project. This is a really challenging time. It's probably the most challenging time in our histories. Certainly for me, I have never experienced anything quite like this in my lifetime, and I suspect that's true for most of you. On top of the pandemic, there is the continued presence of inequities, of racism, and of violence that we see perpetrated against Black people and other people of color in our country today, which is really the tip of the iceberg of 500 years of discrimination that is coming to the fore. So these are difficult times, and many people report being uncertain, being agitated, stressed. And this is a difficult time for children and families. We see the unemployment rate skyrocketing. Kids are no longer in their usual situations of school and other kinds of childcare. And so this is just so difficult. And what good might we see in this, and what words of hope might I offer? Well, let me suggest a few, and then I'll talk about well-being itself. First, we need to recognize that in a situation like this, there are a lot of things that we cannot control. In fact, most of the things that have caused the current predicament are really beyond any single person's control. And when we reflect on this a little bit more deeply, there's really only one thing that we can control. And what is it that we can control? We can control our own minds. While our minds are shaped by the forces around us unequivocally, we also have the capacity to change our minds, to transform our minds in ways that can actually help and to promote human flourishing. When we reflect on the pandemic, we have been issued public health recommendations, and unfortunately, the term that's been chosen by our public health officials is social distancing. And I think this is a very unfortunate choice of words. We're really being asked to physically distance, but we can remain socially connected while still being physically distant. It's a very important idea to keep in our mind. Secondly, when we do physically distance, we're actually engaging in an act of generosity, because we're not physically distancing only for ourselves. We're physically distancing because it is in the interest of the public good. We can actually minimize the likelihood that we become vectors in spreading this terrible virus. And so in the simple act of physical distancing, there is really an act of kindness that is embedded in it. This pandemic is also giving many people an opportunity to do things differently. Our lives in so many ways are being disrupted. For some people, it's more than for other people, but I think for the vast majority of people, it's not business as usual. There's something in our lives that has changed. And I think most of you would agree that the trajectory that humanity was on before the pandemic was not a particularly sustainable one. And this is, I think, providing us with an opportunity for some recalibration. And it's my conjecture that the pandemic actually has been, in an interesting way, a powerful catalyst for Black Lives Matter and for the protests that have been associated with it, because it has given people an opportunity to step back from their usual routines and reflect in a deeper way on the predicament in which we find ourselves. And I'll say more about the protests a little bit later. One of the other important aspects of the disruption in our lives that I think can be harnessed in this time is to appreciate the simple things in our lives. We're not traveling as much. We are spending more time at home. This is an opportunity to appreciate our neighborhoods. I've heard many people say that they've noticed trees they haven't noticed before. They have heard birds that they have not heard before. And so this is, I think, an opportunity to cultivate this emotion of appreciation, which is so incredibly important, particularly at this time, because none of us are leading lives that are isolated silos. Each of us depends upon the actions and goodwill of others. And this is a time when we can reflect in a more intentional way and appreciate the actions of others, which are enabling us to function during this very challenging time. So I'd like to now describe a framework for understanding well-being that is at the heart of a lot of work that we're doing in our center. And if we have time, maybe even go through a few-minute practice where we can actually begin to experientially taste what it might be to learn the skills of well-being. One of the conclusions that we've been led to is the title of the talk for this evening, which is that well-being is a skill. All of the research that we've done leads us inevitably to this very simple but very radical conclusion. The learning of well-being is fundamentally no different than learning how to play a violin or learning a complex sport. If you practice, you will get better. That's the key. So what are these four elements or four pillars of well-being as we describe them? The first pillar of well-being is awareness. Now, some of you may be surprised to hear awareness somehow connected with well-being. What does it have to do with well-being? Well, the capacity to voluntarily control our attention is part of awareness. And it turns out that this capacity is intimately related to our well-being. When we're distracted, when our minds wander, particularly when they wander away from whatever it is that we're doing, it is toxic. It actually takes a toll on our well-being. There's a very famous paper published in a very prestigious scientific journal about 10 years ago, and the title of the paper is "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." When our minds wander, we're less happy. This particular article did a study where they found, this was in more than 3,000 adults in different parts of the world, and they found that the average adult spends 47% of her or his waking life not paying attention to what they're doing. 47% of the time. And when people were not paying attention to what they were doing, they were less happy. Folks, we can do better. And it's not that difficult. So awareness is the first component of well-being. The second component of well-being, or the second pillar, we call connection. And connection is about the qualities that sustain healthy social and interpersonal relationships. Qualities like appreciation and kindness and gratitude and compassion. These are all qualities that can be nurtured. And it doesn't take much, again, because research shows that these qualities are actually part of who we are. We call this innate basic goodness. Every human being comes into the world with a preference, a propensity for the good, for pro-social interaction. And we're born in a way that we talk about this in a way that's similar to the way scientists talk about language. We all come into the world with a biological propensity for language. But in order for us to learn a language, we need to be nurtured, surrounded by a proper linguistic community. And similarly for qualities like kindness. But we come into the world with a bias or a propensity for kindness. And there's a lot of evidence now to show that this is true, but it requires that we nurture. The third pillar of well-being is what we call insight. And insight is insight into the fundamental nature of the self. We all have a narrative about ourselves. We tell ourselves stories about who we are. And at the very extreme, there are people who have very negative self-beliefs, and they actually hold those beliefs to be a true description of who they are. And of course, that gets us into trouble. So part of well-being and flourishing is having a healthy sense of self, and particularly having a healthy relationship to this narrative, being able to see this narrative for what it is. And finally, the fourth pillar of well-being is purpose. Finding our true north, the sense in which, or the direction in which our life is headed, particularly around what psychologists have called self-transcendent values. That is, values that go beyond oneself, values that involve serving others, helping others. And it turns out that this is an incredibly powerful predictor of other aspects of well-being. And in fact, in research in the later decades of life, it's the single most important psychological predictor of mortality, holding everything else constant, purpose in life. And what is of a special importance here is how we can align more and more of our everyday behavior with our sense of purpose. Can we imbue virtually everything we do with our core sense of purpose? Can taking out the garbage be associated with our core sense of purpose? It can. We can learn to do that. And that is something that can have a dramatic impact on our overall well-being. But all of this requires practice. One of the things that we have discovered in neuroscience is that there are two fundamentally different forms of learning. One form of learning we call declarative learning, which is learning about stuff. So we can learn the value of kindness. We can learn the value of honesty. But I think casual reflection will convince you that if you have a person and sit them down, have them read a book about kindness or read a book about honesty, it won't necessarily make them a more honest person or a more kind person. We also need the second form of learning called procedural learning. Procedural learning is skill-based. It's acquired through practice, and it's represented in totally different brain circuits. We need both in order to promote human flourishing. But in our culture, and in most Western cultures, declarative learning is privileged over procedural learning. And in fact, in our schools, declarative learning is privileged. And at the level of the university, it's almost exclusively declarative learning. And this is unfortunate. We need to incorporate these elements of procedural learning to learn to nourish the heart and the mind to cultivate these skills of well-being. I want to say a few things about one or two of these components of well-being in a little bit more detail and tie them into the extraordinary movement that is spontaneously erupting in not just our country, but across the world to combat racism, which I think is so important, and in my view, is a very hopeful sign for humanity. Some might wonder whether it's possible to cultivate all of these beautiful qualities of well-being and at the same time be angry. Well, there is a kind of anger which I think is really important and legitimate, and the anger that I think all of us felt when we saw videos of George Floyd being murdered by a Minneapolis policeman and many other instances of violence against members of people of color, as well as other instances of bias. There is, I think, a natural response that we might think of as moral indignation, which is an important form of anger. I think it's important to say that violence and hatred doesn't need to be part of anger. We can harness the energetic quality of anger and use it in a constructive way, I think, as a force for good. One of the really interesting neuroscientific findings that we and others have observed when we study the brains of people who are engaged in practices to cultivate compassion, that is to relieve the suffering of another, is we see circuits in the brain that have to do with action. We see those circuits activated. Even though we're studying, in this case, people who are meditating and are perfectly still, they're not moving. And yet we see these action circuits in the brain that are activated. And what this suggests to us is that compassion is actually preparing us to act when the circumstances allow for that. And so these practices, some of these practices at least, are practices of action preparedness. They prepare us to engage in a very active way with the world in a constructive way should the opportunity arise. So a kind of practice for skillful action. So let me just say a few other words about the situation that we're in now, and also a few words about our youth, since that is an important focus of the Rainbow Project. And I'd like to end with a brief period of practice. So one of the really important observations that we and other scientists have made is that one of the most important ways to teach our children the kind of skills that we're talking about here is by embodying these skills ourselves as adults. And so this requires that we practice our own skills of well-being. And this is true for therapists, it's true for teachers, it's true for parents, for any of us in any capacity, in any way in which we interact with youth. The extent to which we can embody these qualities of well-being, we will communicate that in a very powerful way through which children can absorb it. They can learn it through a kind of automatic social learning. And so it's really important for us adults to take on this mission of nurturing our mind. One of the things that I remind people of very frequently is that when human beings first evolved on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth. And yet today, I think it's fair to say that almost everyone on the planet brushes their teeth, typically a couple of times a day. And we do this because we recognize that this is important for our personal physical hygiene. This is not in our genome. This is our learned behavior. And I think most people, particularly those who are joining us this evening, would agree, and pardon me if there are any dentists in the audience, but I think most people would agree that their minds are even more important than their teeth. And yet, we're living in a culture which, unfortunately, we don't take the time to nurture our minds. And this is a call, and I would say an urgent call, a public health need, an urgent public health need to nurture our minds in the same way that we care for our teeth. My conviction is that if we spend even as short a time as we spend brushing our teeth every day, intentionally nurturing our mind, this world would be a very different place. If we go back 50 years and look at the percentage of people in the population of adults who are engaged in regular physical exercise, that number is 50 years ago is a lot lower than it is today. Not everyone physically exercises, but many of us incorporate physical exercise into our weekly routine. And we do it in part because the scientific evidence shows it's good for us, it's important for our health. Nurturing our mind in the way that I'm describing is also important, not only for our mental health, but also for our physical health, because well-being, psychological well-being, actually has biological consequences. And we know that people who report higher levels of well-being are actually physically healthier. And there's a lot of evidence, which is growing every year, that suggests that nurturing our mind in this way has beneficial effects on our biology and on our health. One of the things that we've done as part of our center, which is been done through a nonprofit associated with our center, we have developed an app called the Healthy Minds Program, which is a scientifically based app that has mini science podcasts and short practices designed to nurture each of these 4 elements of well-being. And it's totally free. It will always be free. And you can learn more about it by going to tryhealthyminds.org. Tryhealthyminds, all one word, .org. And please take a look. And if you feel so inclined, the reason we disseminated this is to help people develop a practice which is a regular practice. And one of the things that we give people an opportunity to do in this program is to engage with these practices while they're doing other activities of daily living. So you actually don't have to take another minute out of your day. You can do this while you're brushing your teeth. You can do this while you're physically exercising. You can do this while you're washing the dishes or cleaning your house or taking a walk. So it doesn't require that we take any extra time out of our day. So let me end now with just giving you a little taste of these practices. We're all in front of a screen, and so I invite you to close your eyes, since we are all spending a lot of time around screens these days. And let's sit in an upright posture. We like to sit in a way that is dignified, but not too tight, not too loose, really to stay awake. And let's bring awareness into our bodies. And simply notice whatever may be happening. There is no need to change anything. There's no need to fix anything. This is simply an invitation to become aware. And as our bodies and minds are settling, let's see if we can find within each of us an altruistic motivation for engaging in a practice like this, recognizing that if we calm our minds and open our hearts, it's beneficial not only for ourselves, but for all the others that we touch directly or indirectly. So let's spend a few moments connecting with that motivation. And now just taking a minute or two to sweep awareness through the body, beginning with our head, our face, our jaw, our neck, our shoulders, our arms, our hands, fingers, our chest, both the front and the back. Simply being aware. Our legs, thighs, knees, our shins, our ankles, our feet, our toes, infusing our whole bodies with awareness. We are embodied creatures. And bringing awareness to the body is something that is so simple. We can do this anytime, anywhere. It doesn't require us to be, quote, meditating. We can do this as we're walking, as we're talking, as we're interacting with others, just sensing what's going on. Now, let's bring into our mind and our heart one or two people who are important to us, particularly during this time of the pandemic. People who have been helpful to us in one way or another. It might be a person we live with. It might be our spouse. It might be a child. It might be a caregiver. It might be a delivery person. It may be a medical provider. Whoever it might be, let's bring them into our mind and our heart. And see if we can find this sense of appreciation for all that they're doing that is of benefit during this time. And even reflecting on how we might express our gratitude to this person the next time we have this opportunity. And finally, as we draw this very short period of practice to a close, let's reflect on purpose. Why is it that you are engaged in whatever activities you might be engaged? Whatever those activities. Why do you eat? Well, we eat because we have to stay alive. But why is it important to stay alive? What are the larger aspirations that we have? And can we begin to see more and more of what we do, even seeing something like our breathing? Every inhale that we take, we're sustaining our bodies and minds so that we can potentially serve others. And as we reflect on the possibility of this kind of value and purpose, let's reflect on how we can bring whatever we may have gleaned from this short period together this evening and bring it into our everyday lives. So with that, let's open our eyes and re-engage and see if we can retain the same quality of awareness as we re-engage with our program this evening. So I will stop there and look forward to having an opportunity for some discussion. Thank you so much.
Okay, Dr. Davidson, thank you very much for those powerful and insightful words. And I have to tell you that my father-in-law is a dentist, and he would agree that the mind is more important than brushing your teeth, but then he would add, make sure that you floss. That is very important. Okay, for all of you who are with us, that's going to be the Q&A section. Our mediator will read the questions aloud for Dr. Davidson to respond to. And Dr. Davidson, if I may just ask you a question while I have you here.
Please.
In light of everything that has been going on, from the pandemic to the racial tensions that we are witnessing, not only in our own community, but really around the world, life, as we all know, has changed incredibly. And you're talking about the 4 pillars, awareness being a big one of that. What advice would you give to people? Because so many have been stuck at home with their children, trying to balance the family life plus work and whatever else that might be going on. When you're in that heightened situation and an expression that I've learned was, when emotions are high, logic is low. And I feel like I have seen a lot of people encountering that lately. What advice would you give to people to be able to stop that before they react? Sometimes, you get too heated and you just do something. So in a time like this, especially since, in the news, I've read far too many stories about how abuse has gone up. What can we do?
Yeah, so thank you for asking that, Charlotte. It's a really important question. And I would say that, first of all, it's absolutely true that findings show that abuse has gone up, depression has gone up, anxiety has gone up. But one of the things the media doesn't do is tell us about all the positive things that are happening. They're less interesting than the less common but more dramatic negative stuff. So When I was a student, I was taught when we look at a person, we should look and find out what's wrong with them. The invitation here is to look at people and find out what's right with them. And it's a different orientation. And so my advice, to be specific, for parents and families is to, first of all, find some simple daily rituals where you can all come together and nurture well-being. And one of the opportunities for that, I think, is around mealtime. We all have to eat. It is the case that our food on the plate is dependent on so many people. If we actually think about what it takes to have a meal on our plate at home, and the number, if we really deeply think about how interconnected we are, from the farmers that grow the food, etc., it's quite extraordinary. If we take literally 1 minute before each meal for a family practice of appreciation for the food that we're eating, it is a time for grounding, for settling the emotions, for appreciation and gratitude, for connecting with the family. And I think that those moments, it doesn't take that much, but if they occur with regularity, it can have a really beneficial impact on a family system.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks again, Richie, for that really great and uplifting talk. We really, really appreciate it. One attendee asks if you know of any research that sort of tries to capture the level of stress for Black children growing up in this state or country, and particularly mention that they're interested in getting information about studies that don't look at just victims of assault, so that you can really try to capture some sort of measure of stress on Black children in America.
Yeah, there are such data, and it's a very important question. And there's no question that being Black as a child in America is because of social conditions and inequities and bias and prejudice and racism, it gets under the skin, and it actually impacts the developing brain as well as systemic biology. Black children are more vulnerable to many different kinds of disorders, including various physical disorders. And in part, it's associated with living in poorer neighborhoods, being exposed to more air pollution, and it goes on and on. And so there's a huge number of risk factors that are associated with this, and there's good evidence of a descriptive nature showing how the playing field, so to speak, is not at all level. And Black children are subjected to enormous adversity simply because of the color of their skin. And this is a profoundly disturbing piece of scientific evidence that I think is kind of the psychological and biological reflection of racism, of systemic racism in our country. And it's one of the many reasons why we in our center have become activist scientists. It's kind of like climate scientists. We think the scientific research is still of utmost importance, but it in and of itself is not sufficient to produce the change we need to produce. And so we have enough evidence that systemic racism gets under the skin and affects the brain and the body. And I think we need to do everything we can to combat racism and to work to change our society in whatever ways we can. You know, so each of us lives in a different ecology, a different niche, and has different kinds of opportunities. But one of the things that actually makes me optimistic is the protests, is the engagement of very large sectors of the population that weren't previously engaged. I think that historically white institutions are now recognizing the role that they've played in perpetuating systemic racism, and are taking it upon themselves to do more of the really deep inner work that I think will be required to address that. And I think that some of the practices for cultivating well-being that I described are in part practices which we know will reduce, for example, objective measures of implicit bias, and also help to promote more engagement with real action that I think could make a difference.
Thanks for that answer. I really appreciate that, and always have appreciated about your work that you've been very much about translating it outside of academia to actually impact the lives of people. So thank you for that. Someone else asked if you could speak about your research with the kindness curriculum in schools and early childhood programs.
Sure. We've developed a curriculum for preschool children called the Kindness Curriculum. It is a curriculum that takes two of the elements of well-being, awareness and connection, and translates it into a curriculum that is appropriate for 4 and 5-year-olds. And we've tested it in a randomized controlled trial in public schools here in Madison. We've published that scientific study, and the randomized controlled trial, which is a kind of gold standard of scientific clinical research, indicates that this curriculum is really beneficial. And we've decided to freely release the curriculum. Anyone can download it from our website. It's available in English and in Spanish. It's being used now in about 35,000 schools worldwide. And we're really happy to see it being widely used. We also have a partnership with Sesame Street, where they've used some of the elements of the kindness curriculum in some of their programming. And so there's a lot more work that needs to be done with this, but it is getting out there, and we're happy to see it being used.
Awesome, thanks for that. Someone else mentions that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, many of the things they're used to doing on a regular basis are canceled. And oftentimes they naturally feel depressed after that. So they're kind of asking for advice about how to kind of manage some of those feelings.
Well, I think that there's going to be inevitable disappointment. I've experienced that myself. On the other hand, one of the other things I've experienced is I was supposed to participate in some event where they expected 200 people. And instead, the event was done online, and around 20,000 people participated. It's wonderful, freely offered. And so I think there's certainly disappointment, but I think there's a real upside to this. And I don't think our lives will ever go back to, quote, normal. I think we've been irrevocably changed by this pandemic. And it's not to say that everything should be done virtually, but I think we've recognized what we can do in terms of reach. Doesn't mean we still shouldn't have stuff happen in person. We will, but we can also simultaneously webcast it, make it available on a much more widespread basis. And so I think that we need to remind ourselves of some of the unintended benefits that have occurred as a consequence of this as well.
Yeah, and to that point too, thinking about sort of clinical practice shifting to being more focused on telehealth. I mean, that's a huge thing that I think has made receiving mental health services a lot easier for many folks. So.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, Ian, and it's going to, I think, dramatically reduce the barriers of access in communities, not just in the US, but really all over the world. I mean, the reality is that that cell phones are prevalent in one of the things I joke about, I go to India a lot with in terms of my ongoing relationship with the Dalai Lama, and the cell service in rural India is a lot better than it is in rural Wisconsin. It's a sad fact, but it's true. And so we'll catch up, hopefully, but it is something that I think will really make a difference.
All right, and I think this is going to be the last question. So this is again about the kindness curriculum. Is there or will there be longitudinal studies done on the students who participate in that?
It's a great question. It's certainly our aspiration that there will be. Those kinds of longitudinal studies have to be very large. They're very expensive, and somebody needs to fund them. And so if we happen to find the right opportunity and have the right kind of support, we will do that. It's something that really needs to be done. But let me say something that I think is relevant to that, which is important. And that is that I don't believe for a minute that kids who go through the kindness curriculum and then don't have an opportunity and encouragement to continue to practice the skills that they've been taught, I don't think the effects will persist, is my just conjecture. And so our aspiration is that the kindness curriculum provides kids with the beginnings of skills and practices that will become a lifelong practice. We all know intuitively we can go work out with a trainer and go to the gym every day for 2 weeks and feel a difference in our bodies, but none of us believe that if we stop doing physical exercise, that the benefits we experience will persist. And the same is true here. And so what we have to do is to build in supports in our schools, in our after-school programs, with parents, with teachers, to continue to provide support and opportunity for both the kids and the teachers and the parents together to engage in these practices, which is the way in which the benefits will endure.
Right, and I think that was our last question. So thank you again, Richie. And I'm going to hand it off to Charlotte now.
All right. So that concludes our Q&A portion with Dr. Davidson. Dr. Davidson, thank you so very much for your time this evening. We really appreciate you being here with us. And we would greatly appreciate if all the attendees out there would stick around for some closing remarks from Cheryl. Cheryl, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Davidson, so much. I shudder to think if we didn't have you, and the world doesn't have you, because more and more I think about, well, what is the purpose then of well-being? And I think about all the things that are happening now, and with that strong inner strength and stamina and fortitude that you eventually build, we can be more open to compassion towards others. We can really be available to learn and grow in thinking about what can they do about racism. I think the fragility of people is preventing them often from that kind of personal and social growth. And that's what's so important about mindfulness and the work that you're doing. And it really focuses on the positive, not the negative. So I so appreciate that. I appreciate too Green Clock, and I appreciate everyone who has participated, who made the video, who was part of the video. And Charlotte, thank you again so much. I hope that folks will stay involved and participate. What other populations would we be working with other partners? So it really is, you are all stakeholders, and we really want to hear feedback from you. Thank you, everyone.